All right, so you're ready to explore something that's really stood the test of time, huh? I mean, we're not just talking about any old book today. We're going deep, really deep into Don Quixote. This book, it's like a treasure chest of insights into human nature, this craving for adventure, and, the sheer magic of a good story.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those works that just keeps on giving, you know? No matter how many times you read it or how much time passes, there's always something new to discover in Don Quixote.
And we've got a whole stack of resources to guide us on this journey. Not just the novel itself, but also like the opinions of experts who've studied it for years, the thoughts of those who've had the daunting task of translating it, and even, get this, poems that bring its characters to life in verse.
It's a real deep dive, that's for sure.
Our mission today, if you choose to accept it, is to go beyond the surface,
Hmm.
to really uncover those surprising details about how Don Quixote came to be, the fascinating people within its pages, and why, after all these centuries, it still speaks to us in such a powerful way.
It's kind of like a shortcut, right? A way to get to the heart of this massive book without feeling like you're getting lost in its sheer size.
Right. So, okay, let's start with the man himself, Miguel de Cervantes.
Yeah.
Right from his own introduction to the book, you get a real sense of his hopes for it, but also there's this kind of, I don't know, almost like preemptive humility.
Oh, yeah, I see what you mean.
He talks about his sterile, ill-tilled wit. It's almost like he's bracing himself for criticism, like before anyone's even read a single page.
It's such a fascinating glimpse into his mindset, right? And if you think about it, the translators, the folks who've brought his words to us across time and language, they add another layer of interpretation, don't they?
Totally.
I mean, take Shelton, for example. His translation, which was one of the first into English, is described as really racy, full of life.
Yeah.
It's probably because he was a contemporary of Cervantes, so he likely picked up on nuances that later, more academic translations might have missed.
Makes you wonder, right? Like, how much of our understanding is shaped by those initial filters?
It's a great question.
And then you've got Jervis, whose translation is considered more accurate, but also kind of wooden in comparison.
Yeah.
But the thing is, Jervis, he really seemed to get the humor in Don Quixote. There's this quote about the unsmiling gravity of quixotic humor. It's not all slapstick.
Oh.
There's this seriousness underneath it all, which
It's so important to recognize that.
it's
Yeah.
kind of a bummer that modern editions sometimes smooth out Jervis' style without even, like, double-checking with the original Spanish.
Oh, yeah, I agree. It's like a game of telephone, but across centuries. It changes the whole feel.
Right, so each reader, depending on their translation, is getting a slightly different version of Don Quixote.
Exactly.
Okay, speaking of different versions, the origin of Cervantes' name is kind of trip, right?
Uh-huh.
It goes back to Nuno Alfonso and this castle called Cervatos, which, if you look into it, it ties him to these knights who were fighting against the Moors, like way, way back. And get this, his family, they actually had real knights errants in their lineage. I mean, how crazy is that?
That's wild.
It makes you wonder if that heritage, having this real connection to chivalry, somehow influenced his writing. Even if, in a way, he's kind of poking fun at those old ideals.
That's such a crucial point. I mean, if you connect it back to the book's themes, this personal link to a knightly past adds this whole other layer of irony.
Yeah, for sure.
It's almost like Cervantes is both drawing upon but also gently teasing a tradition he knew intimately, right? I think it makes us think about how we're all shaped by the stories we inherit, even when we try to challenge them.
Oh, absolutely. And Cervantes' life, before he even started writing, it was full of adventures. He served as a camarero, like a chamberlain to Cardinal Acquaviva. So that could have been his path, the church route.
Yeah.
But nope, he goes and becomes a soldier, fights with incredible bravery at the Battle of Lepanto. He's wounded there, actually loses the use of his left hand. But the sources, they really highlight his courage, saying he preferred death to health in the service of his king and God. And he actually got recognition for his valor, too. So this guy, a man of real-world courage,
Hmm.
creates this character whose bravery is, well, mostly in his own head.
Right.
Makes you wonder, like, about the different forms courage can take and how much our internal narratives shape our actions.
It really does. It's like this guy's lived a life of actual heroism, and then he creates Don Quixote, who's, well, let's just say his heroism is more self-proclaimed. It highlights how different people, even those who've seen real battles, can strive for those ideals.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But his real-life drama, it doesn't stop there. 5 years as a captive in Algiers, he tried to escape multiple times, but no luck. Finally, he was ransomed. But even then, he had to deal with false accusations and fight to clear his name. It's a wild story, just as captivating as any fiction he wrote.
You can definitely see how that experience, the hardship, the resilience, might have seeped into his writing.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, knowing all that makes you wonder if those experiences subtly shaped Don Quixote's own kind of crazy determination, even when he's facing ridiculous odds.
It's a connection worth considering, that's for sure. Okay, so we've got this complex author, right? But how did Don Quixote actually come into being? It's kind of surprising. After the first part became a hit, there wasn't this immediate rush to write a sequel. Cervantes, he was actually more interested in his novelas ejemplares,
Right.
which were his short stories.
Yeah, it's interesting how an author's idea of their best work doesn't always line up with what really grabs the public.
It's true, you never know what's really going to resonate, do you?
Nope, you don't. And get this, the way Cervantes describes Don Quixote, it's really telling. He calls himself more of a stepfather to it than a father.
A stepfather.
Yeah, and the sources, they kind of suggest that maybe he wrote it quickly, a bit carelessly even, and that he might not have proofread it that well.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine that for a book that's considered like a cornerstone of literature.
It's a good reminder that sometimes brilliant things can come from unexpected places.
Right, like it wasn't all planned out.
And his whole attitude towards the book is so interesting. He saw it as a mere libro de entretenimiento, something to lighten the mood, to divert the melancholy, moody heart. It's such a huge contrast to how we see it now, this really profound work.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And it makes you think maybe the power of a story can be even greater than what the author originally intended.
For sure.
It seems like at that time, Cervantes was really passionate about the theater. He later published his comedies in these short plays called interludes, and he was pretty bummed out that they weren't a huge success.
Really?
Yeah, he had strong opinions about the state of Spanish theater. He really wanted to shake things up.
Wow.
It's almost like Don Quixote, the work he's most famous for, was kind of a side project for him.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Despite wanting to be a big playwright, it was this other book, Don Quixote, that ended up, well, changing the world of literature.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible.
Oh.
Okay, so we've got this complex author, a book he maybe didn't take that seriously. What makes it so enduring? Let's talk about the humor.
Okay, yeah.
The sources really highlight this idea of the perception of the incongruous.
Yeah.
Basically, it's that clash between Don Quixote's super grand chivalric ideals and Sancho Panza's very grounded practical reality.
That's a huge part of what makes it funny, that contrast. You've got Don Quixote interpreting everything through this fantasy lens, and Sancho's just there like, dude, what are you talking about?
Right. And they both take their views so seriously.
It's not just about getting a laugh. It's about showing us fundamentally different ways of seeing the world, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And the sources, they emphasize how important it is that Cervantes plays it straight. It's not like he's winking at the reader like, get a load of this guy. There's this quote about Cervantes' serious air, which is so essential to the humor.
Yeah, it's not silly slapstick. There's this weight to it, this gravity that makes the comedy even funnier.
Right. It's funny because Don Quixote truly believes in his delusions.
Exactly. It's not that Cervantes is saying, look how ridiculous this is. It's more like he's letting the absurdity speak for itself, which in a way makes us think about how easily we can all get caught up in our own beliefs, right?
Totally. So let's zoom in on Don Quixote himself. This guy, he gets so wrapped up in those old stories of knights and chivalry that he literally transforms himself into a knight-errant.
He goes all in.
All in. He gives himself this grand new name. Alonso Quijano becomes Don Quixote of La Mancha.
Very fancy.
And of course, he can't forget his trusty steed, Rocinante, which, let's be honest, is just his old nag of a horse. And then there's his lady love, Dulcinea del Toboso, who, spoiler alert, is completely imaginary.
Oh, yeah, that's important. It's not just delusion. It's like he's building a whole new identity based on these stories he loves.
It's like a testament to the power of stories, and to that human need to find meaning, even if it's in, well, unusual places.
Absolutely. And his early adventures, they really highlight how disconnected he is from reality. Leaving the inn, which he sees as some grand castle, the knighting ceremony by the innkeeper who's just playing along, and then demanding those traders acknowledge Dulcinea's beauty, which, well, let's just say it doesn't go so well for him.
It's like right from the start, Cervantes sets up this comedic tension. Don Quixote is trying to live by the rules of a time that's long gone.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly. And then there's the windmills, probably the most famous example of this. He sees them as giants.
Classic.
It makes you wonder, right?
Yeah,
How often do we all misinterpret things based on our own beliefs and biases?
all the time, probably. And Cervantes, he uses these moments like the windmills as giants or those friars just traveling along who Don Quixote sees as kidnappers. He's poking fun at those chivalric romances, but also at that human tendency to cling to our own little versions of reality even when they don't quite match up.
Now, of course, you can't talk about Don Quixote without talking about Sancho Panza. He's introduced as a poor laborer, just Don Quixote's neighbor, but he gets convinced to become his squire.
For the promise of governing an island. Right. Pretty tempting.
Totally. Sancho, he's all about practical stuff like food and safety, and he loves his donkey Dapple.
Even though Don Quixote thinks donkeys are beneath him.
Right. But that's what makes their dynamic so great. Sancho's down to earth, while Don Quixote's off in the clouds.
It's that classic comic duo. Think about that night they spend among the trees. Don Quixote's up all night thinking about Dulcinea. Sancho's snoring away after a good meal.
Or when Sancho loses his saddlebags, his alforjas, he's devastated. Those were important to him.
Real material loss.
Right. Don Quixote's more concerned with honor and glory, which, are a bit more abstract.
It's through these little interactions that you really see how differently they approach life.
And it leads to some great laughs, too.
Hmm.
Okay, so we've got these characters, this humor. What are some of the big themes in Don Quixote?
Okay, well, the most obvious one is illusion versus reality. Yeah.
Which is everywhere in the book. I mean, Don Quixote is constantly misinterpreting things, and it makes us think about how we all see the world, like
Yeah.
how much of what we believe is really true.
It's deep stuff, but presented in this entertaining way.
And then there's love, or at least Don Quixote's very unique idea of love.
Right, Dulcinea, the woman who doesn't even exist.
Exactly. But Cervantes also gives us this other perspective on love through Marcella, the shepherdess.
Oh, yeah, Marcella. She's amazing.
She's strong, independent, and she refuses to be bound by romantic expectations. There's this really powerful scene at Chrysostom's funeral. He died of a broken heart, basically, because she didn't love him back.
It's so tragic.
And she delivers this speech where she basically says, look, I have the right to choose who I love, or if I love anyone at all, it's my life.
It's so ahead of its time, right? Especially for that era. It challenges everything about how women were supposed to behave.
Right. It's a real contrast to Don Quixote's romanticized, kind of distant view of love.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got illusion, love, and let's not forget that Don Quixote isn't just a funny adventure. There's also social commentary in there.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like those discussions about knights errant versus monks and how hard their lives are.
And even though he's totally misguided, Don Quixote tries to help those galley slaves. It shows how Cervantes was using humor to critique the problems of his time.
It's like he's saying, look, even when it's based on fantasy, there's real injustice in the world.
Right. Okay, and beyond the main plot, there are all these other stories woven in, like Cardenio and Lucinda, which is so full of drama and betrayal.
And madness, too.
And we can't forget Dorothea pretending to be Princess Micomicona.
Oh, that's so meta.
It's like characters in the book acting out stories from other books. Cervantes is playing with the lines between fiction and reality, even within the fiction itself.
Yeah, it makes you think about how stories can shape our lives, even if they're not real.
Exactly. And speaking of stories, did you know that our sources also include poems dedicated to Don Quixote and Dulcinea? It's like early fan fiction.
Wow, that's amazing. It shows how those characters captured people's imaginations right away.
So we've covered a lot, right? Cervantes' life, how Don Quixote came about,
Yeah.
the humor, the characters, the themes. It's incredible how this book, which Cervantes might not have taken that seriously at first, has become such a classic. I mean, it's still being read, translated, debated.
It's like everyone finds something different in it, depending on when they read it and what they're going through.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So here's a final thought for you to chew on. We live in a world where information overload is a thing, right? And sometimes it's hard to tell what's real and what's not. So how does Don Quixote's idealism, even though it's often delusional, resonate today?
That's a good question.
What can we learn from his adventures and his misadventures about how powerful our beliefs can be and how important it is to think critically? That's all from us for now. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Don Quixote. We'll be back soon with another stack of sources and another fascinating story to explore.